Alright, this video is about Judaism. Judaism is not the largest of the world religions by any stretch of the imagination. There are only about 14 million Jews in the world today, and that number hasn't been all that much different throughout world history. But Judaism has been incredibly influential in the history of Western Europe and of Western religion in general. The other two monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam, trace their ancestry to Judaism, specifically to the patriarch Abraham. Abraham was a polytheist living in Babylon, in Ur, and he worshipped all of the normal polytheistic gods, but one day heard a call from the god Yahweh, probably a god of battles. One of the original titles for Yahweh was Yahweh Sabaoth, or Yahweh the God of hosts, God of armies. And Abraham heard this call from Yahweh, and Yahweh told him that if Abraham worshipped him and him alone, then he would make his descendants as numerous as the stars. And so Abraham began to worship Yahweh alone of all of the Babylonian gods, and began to practice one of the first forms of monotheism. Now, Abraham did not believe that Yahweh was the only God that existed, but Yahweh was the God for him. Yahweh was the God for whom Abraham had come into covenant. And that idea of covenant, this idea of an agreement between a people and God, is very, very important when you start to think about Judaism. If you look at the history of Judaism, it's a history of covenants. You have the first covenant between the patriarch Noah and God after the great flood. Then you have the covenant between Abraham and God, where Abraham worships Yahweh alone, and he receives descendants as numerous as the stars. Then you have another covenant that comes up later on between Moses and God. After the Israelites, the followers of Yahweh, had been taken into Egypt and basically pressed into slavery, they were offered their freedom by Yahweh. And Yahweh performed many miracles and signs that basically visiting plagues on the people of Egypt, and the Israelites were able to go free. And while they wandered in the desert between Egypt and Israel, on Mount Sinai, Moses received another covenant from Yahweh. He received the law, which Jews call the Torah. We'll talk a little bit about the Torah in a couple of minutes. But this idea of covenant, that there's an agreement between Yahweh and Yahweh's people, is at the heart of Judaism. Torah in Judaism is the law that's given by Yahweh. It can mean a number of different things. First, it's a name for the core of the Jewish scriptures. These are the same as the first 5 books of the Christian Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis and Exodus tell the story of the history of the Jewish people. They go from the creation of the world in Genesis 1 to the Jews reclaiming the Holy Land after their exodus from Egypt in the book of Exodus. The latter parts of the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, give a series of laws that pious Jews must follow. And part of Jewish identity over the course of many centuries has become, how closely are you able to follow those laws? How closely are you following the commands that God has given in the Torah? And so that's one meaning of Torah, that collection of scripture. Another meaning of Torah is the collection of law that's been passed down through the tradition of the rabbis. A rabbi in Judaism is a teacher, and he's one who teaches how to follow Yahweh, and he teaches how to interpret Torah and how to interpret the law. Now, in order to understand what Rabbinic Judaism is all about, I've got to go back just a bit. Judaism changed a lot in the first century of the Common Era. That's the first century A.D. for those who are familiar with that terminology. And it changed um, for a reason. In the year 70, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. Prior to 70, the temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life. It was the place where sacrifice to Yahweh was offered. And so if you were a practicing Jew and you were practicing Torah, you followed the law of the Torah. And if you didn't follow the law, you offered a sacrifice as a ritual of expiation, a way to kind of cleanse yourself and cleanse the community. And so if you read, for example, the book of Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, you'll see a law, and then you'll see a payment for transgressing the law. So if you steal from your neighbor, you need to repay your neighbor what your neighbor is due, plus you have to offer sacrifice in the temple of 2 doves and 3 goats or whatever. And there are very specific sacrificial offerings that are listed in Torah. Now the problem happens in 70. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed, and there's really no place to offer those sacrifices anymore. And so at that point, there's a major shift within Judaism. The focus isn't offering blood sacrifices in the temple, offering animals up as sacrifice. The focus instead is on practicing Torah as closely as possible, and then offering a kind of a sacrifice of praise within your own heart. It becomes more of a personal relationship with Yahweh that is played out through practice of the Torah. And so the rabbis were not temple priests. They weren't about sacrificing animals. They were about teaching people how to live out the Torah in their day-to-day lives. So that brings us to another topic. How is Judaism actively practiced in the lives of people today? If you were to ask many Jews what the core of their faith is, the core, I believe, is to be observant. To be observant of the Torah and of the covenant between human beings and Yahweh. And how do you do that? Well, there are many different things that the Torah asks us to do, and you need to do those things within your life and basically mold your life around what the Torah is asking. You're probably familiar with the kosher rules in the Torah, that the Torah has a number of different rules as to what kind of animals are clean or unclean or can be eaten or are forbidden. And that's part of it. That's part of the practice, what Jews must do in order to be Jews. The general rules of thumb for kosher is that you cannot eat any animal that has cloven hooves and doesn't chew its cud. So that means basically no omnivores. You have to eat herbivorous animals like cows, sheep, goat, etc. You can't eat any bottom feeders or any kind of shellfish or anything like that. No birds of prey. And one of the